Chapter 11. Twin Cities. My father told me many times it was worth it to spend enough time searching for a woman to love, to believe in. He said I would find her when I least expected. The tired throng of refugees crossed the drudgery of Wisconsin into the land of 1,000 lakes. The spring made it much easier for the group's crossing. Matt wondered if Jacobs had taken the weather into consideration even before they left the lodge. There was just no telling how much thought he had put into the travel, or if he was just winging it. Things were more recently going as easily as planning ahead could make them, but the lie still hung over Matt's head. He understood the choice they had faced, he and Jacobs. They could tell everyone about the dead man, the murdered man, which would cause a panic, or they could go their current way and not bring it up. Apparently, no one missed him anyway. Not one person had brought up the dead man's disappearance. Still, it felt like they were lying. The state of the world and the current nature of their existence would further murk the mystery of the missing man. "There's the city," Jacob said to Matt. "Which one is that?" Jacobs chuckled. "St. Paul." The early morning revealed the sight of a city that looked like it had been through a war. The city was almost a ruin now, seasoned by the passing winter that had recently left it behind. The highways revealed no sign of life, carelessly and anciently ruined. Behind the derelict place, there was its sister city, looking equally as desolate. "How could this have happened?" Matt asked, in awe of the horrible sights. This was once the bustling metropolis of St. Paul, Minnesota. It was all carefully planned out, Matt. Matt quickly jerked his head, looking to Jacobs. Jacobs looked back, realizing he revealed more than he meant to. It'll make sense, eventually. He then began walking forward, as the two stood far in front of the great group of people behind them. Matt grabbed at his shoulder as he started. "What do you mean, Jacobs?" "Exactly what I said, Matt," he responded. "Come on." Jacobs led the way to the ruins, to the city. Matt followed him as closely as he could, but he didn't want any more revelations from this man. Jacobs would only accidentally, so he says, reveal something and then retract it. Matt tried hard to put it all together. He didn't want to think about the lie or what else Jacobs had yet to tell him. There were so many pieces to the puzzle that Matt didn't have, and it left him stranded. And there was no way to get it out of Jacobs. He was an exceedingly resilient man who would only tell what he would. The more you pry, the more he would hold back. Matt didn't want his company now anyway, so he let himself fall behind. Just ahead of him, Matt saw Jacobs turn to him as they entered the city, southeast of St. Paul. "Blair!" he shouted as he ran towards him. He approached and spoke, coming to a slow jog. "You and I are going to go into the city and see if there's any signs of life." Matt looked at the man, trying to catch his breath, and shook his head. "Scott!" Jacobs called over Matt's right shoulder. Matt heard Scott's footsteps running up behind him. "Scott, you stay here with everyone. Just keep everyone calm. We'll be moving on by morning," Jacobs continued. Scott shook his head at their leader. Jacobs tapped Matt on the shoulder, and the two men ran ahead of the slowing group. The streets of St. Paul didn't show any signs of life. Matt walked down the roads, awing over what was a modern-day ghost town. The buildings still rose to the heaven, but there was no longer life in any of them. They stood, vacant, dead. Jacobs picked up his automatic TX rifle at his side, gripping it. Matt followed suit as they walked down the streets. "It's quiet," Matt whispered. "Have you ever been here before?" Jacobs asked. "No." "Then you don't know how quiet it really is." Jacobs took off in a mild sprint towards a truck parked on the road. He broke the window and unlocked the door. A loud siren rang from the truck. Jacobs quickly got in and began disengaging the car alarm. It seemed to be taking some time, and Matt grew uneasy with the loud, echoing sound in the abandoned city. The noise ceased, Matt heard a crash from inside of the truck as he closely guarded. He turned to see that Jacobs had broken the covering of the steering column and was trying to hotwire the truck. The truck turned over and started. "Get in," Jacobs ordered. Matt ran to the passenger side as he heard the electric sound of the door unlocking. He got in. Adjusting cabin temp, Jacobs punched at the display screen in the dash of the car, ending the narration. "I hate these things," he said. Matt laughed to himself, remembering how much he used to love the female voice that commentated in his old Silver. A gunshot rang out. "Get down," Jacobs ordered. Matt ducked. "WPF situation, stand down," Jacobs yelled out the broken window. There was a pause. A gunshot. Broken glass. "God damn it," Jacobs whispered, and put the vehicle in gear, spinning out the tires. Matt braced himself as the G-forces began to throw his body weight to the passenger side of the truck. He heard shots go off from inside the truck, breezing by his ducking head. He sat up to see a man falling backwards. "What the?" Matt said suddenly, shoved against the dash on the passenger side. The driver's side door opened up, and Jacobs got out. "WPF situation, stand down," Jacobs yelled. Matt raised his head to see 4 men come out from around the corners with their hands raised. "Your buddy shouldn't have fired," Jacobs yelled. "We aren't here to hurt anyone." The men threw down their guns. Matt hopped out of the truck, running up to Jacobs, who pointed his gun at the 4 men. They stood ever so still. He aimed his gun at them as well. "Why are you firing?" Jacobs commanded the information. A man spoke up. "Why are you stealing the truck?" "We're looking for civilians to take to a secure location." "Are you crazy? Never fired a known WPF soldier." The man looked at his dead friend, who lay on the sidewalk, a hole in his head. "Are there civilians here in the vicinity?" Jacobs demanded. There was another pause. "Are there civilians in the vicinity?" Yeah, the same man spoke up. "Over at the YMCA. Have there been any other WPF civilian rescue attempts?" No. Jacobs turned and flashed a perplexed look at Matt. "Take us to the Y. Leave your guns," Jacobs said. "Blair, you drive the truck." Jacobs walked the men at gunpoint as Matt drove the truck. The YMCA was only a few blocks away. Matt could not help but be distraught by the city and its state of the ruin. The men Jacobs walked seemed beaten, afraid, and willing to help. It was obvious they were not WPF soldiers, something of a militia. He kept a close eye on Jacobs, holding his gun as if he would fire at any moment. He made him nervous now that he would act, though the men were unarmed. The YMCA building revealed itself as an utterly uninhabitable building. The top of the 3-story building was black, burnt, and crumbling. The door to the lower level was still intact as other armed men came running out from the steps that led down. Jacobs was the first to speak. "This is a WPF situation. Stand down," he shouted. The men, confused, placed their weapons on the ground and slowly put their hands in the air. "The area is currently a war zone, off limits to civilians. We come to bring civilians to a secure location," Jacobs continued. The men Jacobs had led to the Y gestured that they should listen. Jacobs turned to Matt. "Blair," he ordered, "I'm going in. You watch these 2. Matt nodded in accordance. He hopped out of the truck, his gun pointed at them. Jacobs ran down the steps to the lower level, escorted by the 2 men guarding the door. Matt was left above ground with the men they initially encountered. The men turned to Matt, their hands on their heads. They looked frightened now, not as threatening. "You're in good hands," Matt said, attempting to lighten the mood. "He's just a little rough around the edges." One of the men didn't take kindly to Matt's comment. "He just fucking killed Jeremy," he yelled, hands still on his head. "He had no choice," Matt said, not willing to accept any defiance. He paused, letting the presence of his words sink in. "Now, What are your names? Willis, said one of them. Kirkpatrick, said the other. I'm Blair. There was some nodding and acceptance of the names, but there was yet an uneasiness in their body language. Shortly, Jacobs came walking up the stairway behind a large line of people, 20 to 30. Matt didn't count. It was mostly children. These men had been charged with protecting them. The men had taken up guard at various sites around the city. It just so happened that they ran into he and Jacobs. It just so happened that they didn't heed Jacobs' call to back down. And it just so happened that one of them was killed. It wasn't clear how this was going over. Jacobs spoke to the men. You have done well guarding these children. We're now joined in the same side in a war that relies on us getting to North Dakota. He paused, letting the information sink in. He walked the length of a line of people, considering his words. We have a group of civilians. We are currently moving to the secure area I speak of. I ask everyone's cooperation in following us and the rest of the group. There was dead silence among them. Their stares hung in the air, as if the information did not reach them. It didn't appear they felt any hope, even as he and Jacobs came to save them. This weighed heavy on Matt's heart. He watched. Dirty women and children, standing all in a line, now had become part of his responsibility. The throng of refugees grew larger. To make matters worse, it soon became evident that Jacobs had killed their previous leader. It was not clear just how this would play into the situation. Now, do I have everyone's cooperation in following me to safety? Jacobs yelled out as an order, showing little empathy in his voice. There was a general groan of agreement in the group. Is there anyone else in the city that you're in contact with? Jacobs continued. Anyone else here? He said, now raising his voice. He looked at the man, who referred to himself as Kirkpatrick. He shook his head no. There was little response from the tattered group. Go gather your things. You're coming with us. You'll be safe, I promise, Jacobs said. Jacob sent Matt with the new group to join the others, while he went and spent the rest of the night passing through the cities, alone, looking for others. Matt thought of the words that Jacobs had said before he left him. I'll meet up with the group. Keep heading west. If I don't make it back, make sure that you get each and every one of these people to the city. It's in the Badlands of North Dakota. Once you're close, they'll find you. The acceptance of danger and the need for survival had now become all but routine. What's this whole city about? Kirkpatrick asked. Matt could sense the man's doubts in his tone. I wish I could tell you, man, Matt answered. It's all Jacobs. He knows what's up, and he doesn't say much about it. Oh, you mean the guy that fucking killed Jeremy? Kirkpatrick said, with obvious emotion. Why the hell should I trust him? Matt looked at him, feeling the man's frustration and feeling of helplessness. He's all you got. Just like me, Matt said. Jacob saw him as a threat. He should have stood down. Matt's justification of Jacob's actions took even him by surprise. Fuck him. This is crazy. You couldn't expect Jeremy to trust you. You look like some crazy motherfuckers got your hands on some military jumpsuits. Goddamn. I know, Matt said. Jacobs was just upholding WPF law. And now, I'm a fucking prisoner. You're not a prisoner, Matt said. Then let me go, Kirkpatrick responded. If Matt let him go, he would ambush them and perform some type of heroics in the name of his dead friend. I can't do that, Matt said. Kirkpatrick laughed cynically. Fucking prisoner. The man fell silent. Matt kept a close eye on both Kirkpatrick and Willis as they rendezvoused with the rest of the group. All by himself? Scott asked in disbelief. Matt explained what had just happened. You know Jacobs, he said. We keep heading west. We'll start in the morning. How'd everything go today? Oh man, everyone's exhausted. We still have a week or so before we get there. And now, if Jacobs doesn't come back, well, none of us have an idea how to get there. He said they'll find us once we get into the Badlands. This seemed to settle Scott for the time being. Get some sleep, Scott, Matt said, with his hand extending to his friend's shoulder. He shook his head in agreement and trotted off to his own camp. Matt laid himself on the ground, with his hands folded behind his head. He looked at the clear, early spring sky. He drifted towards it. For a moment, he forgot who he was and what he was doing, and all that was with him were his dreams of peace. "Matty!" came a familiar voice, abruptly bringing Matt back to this reality. "Hey, honey." He embraces Angela and felt warm. "Aunt Charla said you saved a whole bunch of people today." "Did she?" Matt replied. "I love you, Matty," she said, jumping into a hug. "Aw, honey, I love you too." Angela lay in Matt's arms as they both fell silent and drifted off. Matt lay quietly awake, listening to the tiny breaths that his Angela would take. As he stared out at his sky again, he thought of making a proper home for Angela once they got to the mythical city. She was so precious to him, the innocence left in his world that he so dearly wanted to protect. All the people that he was bringing to safety, all the purpose that he felt in his life boiled down to this one little girl. She didn't know it, but she was saving his life more than he was saving hers. She was his purpose behind all that he did. He thought back to his old life and the freedom he once had, and now he was tied to this one thing: survival. Not just his own, but his little girl. Matt looked at her little face, and his eyes welled with tears. She doesn't deserve this. She deserves a good life. And there, Matt renewed his vow to her as she lay sleeping in his arms. The smallest person he knew had the biggest effect on his life. He would give her the life she deserved. A warm tear streamed down his cheek. In that tear was all that he felt for his little girl who had walked into his life and changed it forever. Matt's body tired, and he started to feel sleep take him. But before he gave in to slumber, he heard footsteps approaching his camp. There was something not especially frightening about them. He had no notion for the steps to be a sign of danger. Instead, he was curious. He turned his head to see a figure, silhouetted by his small fire, stride towards him. Matt roused, propped himself up. He was careful not to wake his Angela. The figure continued to come closer. Matt could now tell it was a woman. She was definitely headed directly at him. He waited to see whom the figure he did not recognize could be. "Excuse me, sir," she said, with a sob recently in her voice. "I need help. There's a boy who is very, very sick. Is there a doctor? I talked to the people at my camp and they pointed me to you. I might be able to help," Matt said. "He has a sickness from the radiation. I think he's dying." Her voice was raised in her crying tone. "I don't know what to do." Beneath, he felt the small body lying at his side begin to move. Angela looked up. "Mommy?" she cried. Matt could tell she was waking out of a dream, and he felt slightly awkward at the situation. Angela ran to the woman and hugged her at her legs. The woman put her hands on the small child's head in an affectionate embrace. She knelt to her. "I'm sorry, honey. I'm not your mother." Matt was astounded at the interaction. It was a completely natural mothering instinct being demonstrated right before his eyes. It was more than he could ever do for her. He could see that Angela reacted to it immediately. Matt paused. "I'm sorry," Matt said. "I think she's dreaming." He swooped Angela up in his arms. She fell right to sleep. Matt and the woman stood up simultaneously. He was locked into her eyes. She was beautiful. Matt found himself wordless, awkward. He simply stared at her, searching for words. From the light of the fire, Matt could make out some of her features. Her blonde hair was tied in a ponytail, and her perfect complexion needed no makeup. Her eyes were wide and green, her face warm and concerned. The woman seemed to press her need. He is very sick and just a young boy. Her eyes were as bright as her hair, like lights, like stars. Her slender figure was hidden by her oversized clothes. Matt's thoughts left him. He tried to force himself to snap out of it. He walked over to the fire and put his Angela down, covering her in her blanket. "There is someone who can help. Follow me," Matt said as he walked away from the fire. He walked on, and she quickly caught up to him. "What are his symptoms?" Matt asked as he strolled on with purpose. "He's been vomiting and had suffered from diarrhea off and on for months. It's worse than it ever has been tonight. I don't think moving him was the best idea." Matt hurried now. They came to a small camp of 4 or 5 older folks that seemed to be quietly sleeping next to their fire. "Charla," Matt said softly as he knelt next to one of them. "Charla, there's a sick boy. He needs your help," Matt said with a whispering urgency. "Have you seen Dr. Carnell?" The old woman looked up and flipped her covers off. She dug around in her bags, looking for supplies in a panic. "Bill," she said to another man sleeping. "Bill, go find Carnell. There's a sick boy." The man looked disoriented, but when Charla repeated herself, he got up and took off in a sprint. Charla brought the first aid kit. They approached one of the campfires. Matt recognized Willis hovering over the boy. "He just lost consciousness," he said. Charla knelt down and put her hand on the little boy's forehead. "Oh my," Charla said. "He's in bad shape." She put a damp towel on his head and started to wake him. "Honey," she said with a shake. "Sweetie, wake up for your Aunt Charla." His eyes opened, and they were glazed and slow-moving. There was confusion in them. "There you go," Charla said to him comfortingly. "You're not doing too well there, mister. What's your name?" "Tim," he said in a weak voice. "Well, Tim, you're scaring your mother half to death." "Oh, he's not my son," the woman interjected quietly. She was obviously his caretaker, just not his mother. Charla looked up at the woman and then to Matt. She realized that she had found yet another orphan. She looked at the nearby campsite and saw that many of the children were orphans. She returned her glance back to Tim. He began coughing as he lay cradled in Charla's arms. "Oh, there, sweetie," she said to him. She hugged him and lay him on the ground. The woman who was his caretaker took her place where Charla had been. Charla pulled Matt aside. "Matt," she said, "it's the same thing we saw at the lodge. He's sick with radiation poisoning." Charla turned and looked back at the woman and the boy, haloed by the fire. "He doesn't have much time, Matt. I don't think he'll make it to the city." Matt looked into her tearing eyes and saw the truth. "I'll stay and watch over them tonight," Charla said. "I'll stay with you," Matt said, looking back at the beautiful woman and the boy. "I'm going to go check on Angela." Charla nodded her head in agreement. Matt turned. Charla attempted to keep the young woman calm. She was obviously very upset. Charla had somehow become the caretaker of the entire group, including the new children. She was also the official nurse of Dr. Carnell. "How you holding up, honey?" Charla said. The woman just nodded, running her fingers through the little boy's hair. "What's your name?" She looked at Charla, tears in her eyes sparkling with the light of the fire. "Lynn. Just call me Lynn. Good to meet you, Lynn." "Who are you people?" Lynn asked. "Well," Charla said, "I'm not sure how to answer that. I'm sure you know we're headed to a city in South Dakota where we'll be safe. We're trying to take care of each other and survive that long." She didn't seem to register what Charla was saying to her. "Seems like it's been a hard time for Yins as well," Charla continued. Lynn nodded. "Is there anything I can get you?" Lynn shook her head. "Is that man leading you, keeping you all prisoner?" "Jacobs?" Charla said in surprise. "Oh, heavens no. He saved every person you see around here. He's a great man." "Well, that great man she said with emphasis. Killed the man that saved all of my people. Charlotte didn't reply, just kept blotting the wet towel on the young boy's head. Jeremy was a great man, Lynn continued, through tears. Well, Charlotte said, all I can tell you is what I know. That man saved all of us here. I owe him my life for that. Maybe you'll come around too. Charlotte could see that Lynn wasn't too sure, but she would take good care of that little boy, and perhaps that would sway her. Charlotte didn't know what happened out there, and she didn't want to know. She owed her life to Matt and Jacobs. Whatever they did, she was sure they had their reasons. She wasn't in any position to question them. As the boy lay in the early morning darkness, the fire showed the perspiration on his forehead. Charlotte still sat, wiping a cool, damp towel on his face. The boy looked peaceful, but Charlotte winced at the frail risings and fallings of his chest. The woman who cared for the boy sat at the boy's feet, a few yards away from him, against a tree. She was dozing off, but kept rousing herself, suddenly, as if it were her duty to stay awake. Darling, you look exhausted, Charlotte said to her. You don't look like you've slept in days. It's okay. I'll watch him tonight. Close your eyes. He's okay. No, she so faintly said. I can't. I'm fine. Suit yourself, Charlotte said. He doesn't have much time, Lynn said. Charlotte just continued to wipe his forehead. Be such a little boy, the woman quietly cried. Honey, Charlotte said, you can't blame yourself for this. You're doing all you can. Charlotte looked up to see a familiar shadowy figure approaching. How is he? Matt asked. He's doing good, Charlotte said to Matt in a mothering voice. It seemed she was speaking more to the boy as he was sleeping than to Matt. Matt looked over at the woman. You should get some sleep. No, I'm fine, she said, sounding slightly defiant. Well, why don't you try? He's going to sleep the rest of the night, Matt said. She paused. Come on, let's go for a walk. You should at least get some air. She looked at him funny, and then pushed herself up with her hands. Matt turned, as she joined him. Matt stared into the distance, viewing far-off lights of campfires he so often saw on these nights. 20 or so campfires that warmed all the travelers in the slight cool of the new spring nights. All the travelers slumbered around these fires, night after night, except for their leader, Jacobs. He still had not returned. Matt turned to the woman. It's a beautiful night. I thought the air might do you some good. Matt noticed that she looked at him funny again. So what's your name? She asked. Matt Blair, he answered. And yours? Lynn, she said. Hey, Lynn, but I just go by Lynn. That's a beautiful name, Matt said. My mother's name was Lynn. Thank you, she replied. There was a moment of silence as they walked. I'm sorry about the little girl. She was dreaming, I think, when she hugged your leg. Actually, I think that was the best thing that happened to me in forever, she replied. So where are you from? Matt asked. Minneapolis. Matt said, stumbling for something to say. I've never been there. Well, except today. But I mean, when it was a city. What's going on, Matt? What happened? Matt's tone became serious. She really had no idea. The same thing that happened all over the country. Nuclear bombs went off. Terrorist bombs. But I thought there was no threat of terrorism anymore, she said, as the news was apparently still a shock to her. Well, apparently, they were wrong. Who could do this? Who hates enough to do these things? I was in the WPF for 3 years, and I think there are plenty of people who could have done this. Plenty of groups. Radical traditionalists. In their mind, they would have helped the world. They used our own technology against us. She thought, the whole country was bombed? She asked. As much of it as I have seen. And Jacob said the whole country had been bombed. I don't know. He has some type of intelligence clearance in the force. I don't know. Who? Jacobs. He was the guy who was with me when we got everyone out of the basement of the YMCA. Oh, the man that killed Jeremy? There was obvious contempt in her voice. Matt shot a fast look at her, and he felt the need to justify. He didn't stand down after Jacobs explained it was a WPF situation. As a matter of fact, Jeremy fired at Jacobs first. Why should Jeremy have even believed him? He was doing the same thing as you were, protecting people. He wouldn't have kept us safe if he believed every stranger shouted WPF when they came close. Matt sighed. I'm sorry. If he had known, it would have been a different story. I'm so sorry. She did not seem to be satisfied with Matt's explanation. Did you know him well? Matt asked. Yeah. There was a time he was more than just our protector, she said. But there were so many times that he saved us. He was one of the first that took care of us after the bombing. He brought so many of the people there. He watched all of his friends die. They were sick, just like Tim. Matt did not know what to say. Guilt ran through his veins, quick, but thick as molasses. It was painful, indeed. Tim won't make it much longer, she said. I feel horrible. She began to cry. But I just wish it was over. He suffered for so long. Matt stopped. He hugged her. She cried into his chest. I'm sorry, I don't know what to say, Matt said, softly to her. Matt let a moment pass, with her tearing, her sadness, onto his dirty green WPF shirt. She leaned into him, and he let it happen. His heart went out to her. He felt so terrible for what Jacobs had done, and doubly so that this child that she cared for was so sick. You should really get some sleep, Matt said. You're so exhausted. She didn't reply. Come on, you can sleep at another camp. I'll go over and make sure that Tim is all right. She didn't say a word, but she followed Matt back to the camp that saw over Angela. Matt covered her up, and she was instantly asleep. He knelt next to her, feeling the cool grass on his knuckles. He looked at her shadowed face as the flames danced on her perfect complexion. Matt felt a deep caring for her in his stomach, or some deeper part of him. Duty filled his mind, as empathy filled his heart for this woman. Lynn, Matt thought. Matt headed back to Charla and Tim. As he walked, he looked up at the summer sky. Something awoke in him. Something all too familiar, but brand new. His past seemed like his past. Dusty and old. But now, he thought of the future. He thought of Steph. Confused, there was a moment of guilt. She was no longer in his life, let alone the world. But still, she had an effect on him. Or the ghost of her did. But it was her that really left him, Matt realized. Was there any space to move on? It didn't really matter. Tim was what mattered. The innocent victim of such a horrible time. The innocence that both he and Lynn saw in these children, Angela and Tim. The innocence they both so wanted to save. Matt saw his destination. Charla's shadowed figure, and another, which Matt assumed was Dr. Carnell, walked towards him. Matt, Charla said, with her hands showing hazard to his arrival. He's gone. Jacobs lied looking out the window of one of the abandoned buildings. He could not be with the group. He told Blair he was going to look for more refugees. Another lie. There was no one left in this city. The buildings were filled with dead bodies, decaying and rotting. He had not decided if he would go back to the group or not. He considered his daily battle. Perhaps this war, this suffering, was all his fault. If he would have just taken orders, followed through, perhaps this all could have been avoided. Maybe it really was all his fault. And now he realized, as he saw the line of sick children file out of the YMCA today, that he had killed these people's version of himself. He killed the man that they called Jeremy, the people of St. Paul's very own savior, their leader. He had let his own people start killing one another. How could he have not seen this coming? With how fucked up the world was, and what these people had been through, he should have known there would be some Full Metal Jacket shit going to happen. But he didn't have anyone watching the people. His people. He failed. Oh, what I would do for a drink, he thought. It wasn't even safe for him to go back. Jeremy's lieutenants would certainly get their justice for killing their leader. Jacobs had no doubt of that. To this point, he could live with himself. He could get everyone to the city, and Maddox would certainly reveal his fate to him. If he had truly failed the mission, Maddox wouldn't let him live. This much could have prevented all this. He should have just followed orders and killed Abudia that night the bombs went off. Maybe he could have prevented all this. Or maybe it was like Abudia claimed, and there was no way to stop what was already in motion. How could he go back? Blair was right. He was starting to lose it. He shouldn't have been so reckless in the city. Maybe he was done. Maybe this was his end. He had lost it all. He had seen Boston, where his family was vaporized. There was nothing left. It was dust. His wife, his son, gone. Blair could get them to the city. He knew that. But if the murderer decided to act again, Blair just wouldn't handle it that well. He's just not ready. Jacob sat up, unholstered his sidearm, and pressed the barrel against his temple. You can do it, he thought. Coward! He screamed. Dogs howled in the city, responding to his call. There was no redemption. He would have to live out his life wondering if it was him that caused the end of the world. He had come up with comic one-liners of mantras and beliefs that he had once held close. He once saw them as the truth. Purpose, redemption, duty. He had lost faith. He didn't know what he believed anymore. He only had his duty left, to get these people to safety. Whatever happened after that, he had to do this. He could not let go. Not yet. This has been a presentation of The Landscape of a Heart, an audio novel by R.P. Watts. Stay tuned next week for Chapter 12, Jacobs Returns. Visit us at whoarewe.blog. Subscribe to this feed. Thank you.